Hello out there in SIGT land and the rest of YouTube. Randy SIGT here, and I've got my friend Aaron, and he's a bit of a collector too, kind of like myself. Aaron's speciality here is more of the older, probably guns of World War I, World War II style. You know, he is not a historian by any means, but he does enjoy the history of these weapons and has done, you know, research in his years of actually owning them. So I'm going to give you Aaron here, and we're going to go over a little bit of history.
Well, hello, as Randy introduced me, I am Aaron, and I do collect, as he put it, as historical firearms. I like to refer to it as weird shit. Now, what I have with me here is what most people will refer to as a Mosin Nagant, or a M9130. Now, M9130 is very easy. The Russians are very simple about their naming of firearms. 91 is actually the first year it was produced, 1891. 30 is whenever they did a re-arsenal where they went and refurbished them, shortened them. They used to be a lot longer, maybe another couple inches at the end. And they re-arsenaled to make them a little bit more modern, because by the time of 1930, they'd been around for about 30, 40 years. So what happened in the history of this, why this gun came to be, is the Russians had a lot of problems in the early part, or the mid to late part of the 1800s, where they had single-shot firearms, similar to a Springfield trapdoor. And they lost a lot of wars, or had a lot of casualties, because people were using repeating firearms, either bolt-action or Winchester repeating lever actions. And they decided, well, we're going to need to make our own. Well, unfortunately, they pissed off a lot of people in Europe, and nobody wanted to work with them. So they would put a contest out to see who would like to design their new main battle rifle. So they had two main applicants. One was Mosin, which is actually pronounced Mosin, and it was actually a infantryman in the Soviet or Russian army. Excuse me, this is the Russian army at the time. And the other one was Nagant, which is actually pronounced, I believe, Nagant. I'm not sure. It's Belgian. I don't know for sure. Now they competed for about 2 or 3 years designing the guns, and what came out is actually a combination of the two. Now Nagant, I'm going to pronounce it that way, Nagant is kind of a misnomer as far as naming this gun, because he didn't really do a whole lot. His design was a much more complicated firearm. It was actually 35 caliber, where this is more of the 30 caliber range. So, and his design was, for example, the bolt. To remove the bolt in this, you just pull the trigger and it disengages, and the bolt is completely removed. It's a field strip, so you can clean the rifle. And to reassemble, it's just lining it back up, ready to fire. Now, his design required you to actually have a screwdriver and unscrew 3 screws. It might have been 2, I'm not sure. But you had to undo screws to remove the bolt to do a field strip. In a battlefield situation, a combat situation, that's obviously not ideal. Anybody that's a veteran, that's not a good idea. So that design was pretty much scrapped. And they did take some of his ideas, though. For example, this has the ability to be fed by a stripper clip. That is one of Nagant's original ideas. And also this magazine floor plate, the inside of this has a spring mechanism, which is his design as well. So it's interesting that his name appears in literature about this as Mosin Nagant, but in reality, you could take his design entirely out and use the original Mosin design, and it would still be the same base firearm. So the Russians never called it Mosin Nagant, actually. So they called it the M9130, actually had a very lengthy name for it, as they tend to do in the military. And it's never used in any literature, Mosin Nagant. Now, they did refer to it as Mosin when the Soviets took over because they were trying to promote national pride, and he was a Russian who had designed their main battle rifle. But it never really was on anything but the M9130 or the M1891 line infantry rifle. All right, we're going to look at some of the markings that you'll find on the M9130s. Now, this is the proof mark for the Tula factory, which is one of two state-run factories for Russia/Soviet Union. This is the Tula factory. This is actually a very hurried stamp, as this is 1943, as you can see the date on there. This is in the middle of the Battle of Stalingrad. So this factory would have been running very quickly. These stamps would have been done extremely fast. So this actually is not the full proof mark. It would actually be a full star with an arrow actually pointing up in the middle of it. But as you can see, it was done rather quickly, so it's not a full proof. And you'll see that with ones of this time period. As they get further on in the years, in 44 and 45, it comes a little bit slower, so they can get better. Ishivek is a triangle with an arrow in it. A little less desirable because it doesn't look as neat as the Soviet star, as you'd like to say, or some people would like to say. Now, this is the serial mark. Now, the Russians used a combination of standard Roman numerals and Cyrillic, which is, I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but that is the Russian language of characters. So you will see characters in here like this looks like a T. It's not really a T. And you'll see sometimes ones that are very strange looking characters, and that's the Russian language, the Russian alphabet. Now, they marked the receiver, the top of the bolt, the magazine floor plate, and the butt plate with stamps for serials. That's where the Soviets would do. Now, this one is matching what is called a forced match. And that means that the receiver, the bolt, and the floor plate all have the same, you don't have to show that, I suppose, but all have the same serial. But the magazine floor plate is what they call forced matched. So this has a different matching that's been scratched through, and they re-stamped it to match the rest of the gun. So this would typically happen because this was in 1943, this was used in combat most likely, so this would have been replaced. Not a big deal as far as what the Soviets were concerned about. So if you're looking for a gun and you're really serious about it being numbers matching, those are the areas you want to look at. If you're looking just to buy a firearm to shoot, then it doesn't really matter that much. They're going to have the same effect. They're going to be re-arsenaled back to the same quality they were when they started. So finally, for this particular firearm, we're going to talk about some things to look out for when you're collecting. Now, this is not a stand firm, hard list of things to look out for, but just some of the stuff I've noticed throughout the years of looking at these. So the serial numbers that I mentioned earlier, they really don't mean anything. The Soviets reused the numbers, and there are no production numbers ever either recorded, or if they are state secrets still in Russia. So we don't really know where the particular serial numbers, where they were used, if they were distributed. However, if you look at the date your rifle was produced, if it was produced before the end of the war, 44, 43, it will most likely have been used in combat, but there is no way to 100% know that. If it was produced in the 30s, very likely it was used in combat, but there's still, once again, no way to 100% know that for sure. If anybody ever says, I can tell you the serial number and what date of manufacture and what number of production it was, that's not true. It's a complete lie. There is no records of it, or if they were, they're not released to the public. Something else to look out for is you'll occasionally see these serial numbers and these different markings highlighted in white. That's done for somebody trying to get a picture. It doesn't mean anything. It was just done for somebody trying to get a picture. Typically it's white crayon, and it really it was never done by the factories. It was never done by the re-arsenal, and you'll see that quite a bit actually in some of the pictures you'll find online. So the serial markings, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, does not recognize the Russian alphabet as part of serials. So some of the older imports, you'll actually find a serial number where they'll have either remarked it or something, and that's typically not common nowadays. Most of the newer ones, if they're newer imports, they'll make up their own serial number to put on there, which is what Century has done with this one. This serial number means nothing. Originally what they used to do was to translate the actual serial number back into the gun, but that's usually not done nowadays because it's just too time consuming and kind of pointless, to be honest. So they usually just make up their own serial number for it. Finally, this is something that is a personal thing of mine. This is the second most mass-produced gun of all time. The first most being the AK47 and its variants. Now, this one is a close second, as in within tens of millions of units. If anybody ever tries to sell you as far as it's very rare, that's not necessarily true. There are rarer variants, but we're talking in terms of they only made 800,000 of them versus 4 million of them. So it's not necessarily that it's rare, quote unquote, but it's rarer. There are certain variants that are rarer than others that are worth more money. For example, the M44 carbine, which is the carbine version, which cut down the stock to about here, and actually Randall has a copy of, was only made at the Tula factory for a year. And so those variants are much lower. So they tend to be worth more. But we're talking again in terms of hundreds of thousands versus millions of units. So once again, if somebody's trying to tell you about how rare a gun is, especially with one of these, look into it. It's probably not as rare as what he's making it out to be. So now we're going to talk about a variant of the M9130, which is the M44 carbine. Now there was another variant of the M9130 which came out in 38, which is the M38 carbine. It's very similar to these, which is what Randy and I have, but there's slight differences. Unfortunately, I don't know them off the top of my head because I do not own one. However, the M44 came out in 1944, and as a result, it was kind of a culmination of notices that the Soviet Army and actually a bunch of other armies were starting to notice in the wartime, which is that a full-length rifle was not all that useful, especially when it came to urban fighting. So you start to see more of what Randall loves, the submachine guns, and you'll also start to see the beginning of the quote-unquote assault rifles. You'll see the Sturmgewehr 44, which is pretty much the prototype of what a AK would look like eventually. Now, there's no record of the AK designer ever seeing one, but it's very similar looking, so they both came at it from the same ideas. So what you'll see carbines more often towards the end of the war, because then they could still use the rifle ammo that they had already produced, but it would be more useful in a building-to-building situation or in a small, shorter range combat. Typically they noticed that combat was happening between 100 to 200 yards if it was long range, or it was indoors, 50 yards to 25 yards to even hand-to-hand. A full-length rifle in that situation was pretty much useless. So they started to see more and more carbines. Now these two both have a fixed bayonet, which is supposed to be attached permanently. However, they can be removed. So you'll see sometimes one without the bayonet, which is unfortunate because they're meant to be on there permanently. Now, Randall's version is Romanian, I believe?
Yes.
So his was made in 1955, and mine is actually a Chinese copy, which is also made in 1955. Now, the difference between the two is actually very minimal. They were both built using Soviet, ex-Soviet stamps tools, both same specifications. However, the difference between the two you'll see is obviously the quality, but the problem with that is that the Romanian or the Soviet ones that you'll find typically were not used in combat. Some of the M44s were used in combat, but once again, like I said with the M9130s, it's difficult to prove it, if at all. But the Chinese Type 53 or the TV was used, so you'll see a lot more wear on their guns. They are the same build quality to begin with, but the Chinese stigma has stuck. So you'll typically find, and I don't like to talk price, but you'll typically find the Romanian, Hungarian, Soviet for about triple or quadruple the price of a Chinese version. And it's essentially the same gun, but you'll typically find them in much better condition, especially the stock. The metal tends to stay about the same, but the stock is typically where you'll see a lot of the differences. And you can see that in the picture that Randall's probably going to be showing right up here. And other than that, really not all much different, but it did lead to a design change in the idea of thinking in the terms of the Soviet mindset with warfare. So this design led to the creation of similar designs that were also carbines, but they couldn't use the full-length rifle cartridge because it wasn't necessary anymore. So you didn't need to be able to hit 500 yards because you weren't engaging at 500 yards. So they didn't need a full-length rifle cartridge. So they decided to cut it down into what would become the 7.62x39, which for any of you AK or SKS fans, you're very familiar with that round. So it is just a cut down version of the full-length rifle cartridge for these. So we can talk about Randy's AK next. Now, Randall has an AK-47, and I am not as well versed on this because I do not have one myself. However, I do know about a little bit of the history of them, and the reason, as we said in the previous part about the M44s, that the Soviets started to notice, and a lot of other countries started to notice at the end of World War II, that engagements were happening at shorter and shorter ranges. There was no need for a full rifle cartridge and a full-length rifle to be in battle anymore. So they decided to come up with carbines as a stopgap solution, which is where you see the M44s. And then as a long-term solution, they decided to come up with something that used a cut-down version of a rifle cartridge. In the U.S., that became the M16. In the Soviet Union, it became the AK-47.
The AK-47 actually was predated by the SKS.
The SKS was not distributed to the Soviet main troops. It was given to satellite countries like Romania, Hungary, and other countries like that. And that's where you'll see a lot of the productions. So that's why in the United States, you'll find a lot more Romanian, Hungarian, and other satellite country SKSs, whereas the Soviet SKSs, the Russian ones, are much more sought after because there's not as many of them. They didn't make them for very long. Now, the only reason actually the SKS exists is because the AK was such a radical design at the time that they weren't even sure it was going to work. So they made the SKS as a stopgap solution. It looks very similar if you look at it to a regular carbine rifle. It's just a 10-round magazine with the exception of what you have been able to modify nowadays with the different modifications. But from the factory, it was just a 10-round magazine. So it was basically just there in case they couldn't use the AK-47 for whatever reason. Now, as we probably all realize, the AK-47 did not fail. It was actually very, very successful and is actually the most mass-produced firearm of all time, with even being featured on countries' flags and part of currency. It was actually featured on a coin by the Soviet Union, and I believe it's on the flag of Mozambique. So it's a very, very iconic firearm.
So where Aaron fails, I'm going to pick up. It's okay because two minds together, we can make a whole.
Yeah.
So AK is, I don't know what the A stands for, but and I could be wrong in this, but it could be Automatica Kalashnikov or something along those. I do know the 47 is actually the year it was produced. Now, Kalashnikov did work on it, prior to that as a conscript in the Soviet army, but it later became production, well after that. He was a mechanic at the time, and he designed the rifle, using his machinist skills and his mechanic skills. I'm not 100% on all these facts, so if you do have any Kalashnikov facts, which I'm sure there's guys that are 10 times more knowledgeable than either of us combined, put them in the comments below. We would gladly entertain that, and you can gladly give a little bit of history right here on YouTube.
So we talked about Randy's AK-47, and one of the reasons why it was very popular was that it was very adaptable into different kinds of guns. You see countless variants of them. I can't even name them all. RBK, AKM. You have the AK-74, which is the remodified version down to a smaller cartridge. There's tons of variants. Now what I have here is a Romanian copy of a RPK, which they actually made into, well, their version is the PSL. Now, this shoots the full-length rifle cartridge, 7.62 by 54R. So these are actually not sniper rifles. They're designated marksman's rifles. These were not meant to be super accurate at very long ranges like your standard sniper rifle would be. This is meant to be something that a squad would carry with them, and that they would be able to engage enemies at a longer distance than a standard AK-74, or an AK-47 would have been able to engage. So you would have just a single guy carry this around, and he would be the designated marksman. Now, this looks very similar to a Russian gun, which is the SVD, commonly called the Dragunov. There's a lot of names for it. I cannot pronounce it properly. And actually, they're entirely different guns. Not a single thing on this gun will copy over, transfer over to an SVD. And neither one will come back to this either. So actually, they're not even the same field of guns. This is solely based off of the RPK, which is based off of the AK-47. So if you look at it, anybody that has an AK-47, it just looks like a bigger AK, as what Randall said. It just looks like they stretched it out and put a muzzle brake on the end. So this one doesn't have as much history. It's a lot newer. They were first made in 1974. So I don't know much about the history of these. However, these were pretty popular, especially in the Middle East. I do have a couple of my friends that have been deployed and to Afghanistan, actually, and they did see people using these as long-range rifles. But other than that, they really were never really deployed to a major war zone, so they don't have much history in that regard. However, they're still really, really cool to look at and really cool to shoot. It's one of those ones where you open up the case of the range and everybody just stops to look at you like, what is that? So if you're wanting a status symbol or something that's very reliable, this is something you want to look out for. Now, prices on these have jumped quite a bit in the past couple of years. So I don't normally do prices, but you'll be lucky to find this for under $1,000. You'd be lucky to find it probably for under $1,500. So it's kind of difficult to get a hold of one of these. They're not banned from importation, unlike the SVD, which is. So that would be roughly $5,000 or $6,000. This is going to be a lot cheaper alternative, and it's, while not the exact same gun, very similar and very straightforward in the same kind of aspects.
So as a final thing, I like to collect what I call weird stuff. This is probably my weirdest gun. This is a model 1895 Nagant revolver. Now, you remember that name from the Mosin Nagant. It's the same guy again. He designed this gun, and this is actually his design, for the Soviet Army to use as their main sidearm. Now, at first these were only issued to officers, and they were only issued in double action. So if you find one stamped before 1914 or 1918, I believe, then you'll see that it's only double action. Now, they made them single action later on because it was cheaper, and those were given to mostly people that were like smaller ranks, sergeants, that kind of thing. So this one is actually double action, so you can see the double action. Now, what's unique about this gun, and just in the fact that it's very strange, is what's called a gas seal revolver. Now, I'm going to have to get a little bit close to the camera here. So, if you can see this, as I pull back the hammer, the cylinder revolves, and then at a certain point it moves forward, and it seals with the chamber, with the barrel. And that is designed to get the maximum amount of power out of the cartridge into the barrel. What's unique about this is that the gun itself can be suppressed very effectively because none of the gas escapes from the gun. In a typical revolver, there'll be a gap, and some of the gaps will escape because the bullet has to jump that gap. There's no gap in this gun, so it can be suppressed to almost nothing. I've seen them before, never done it myself, unfortunately, but I've seen them before where they use, typically they'll use a 9mm that has to be modified to fit this barrel, and all you hear is the click of the hammer, because none of the gas is going out of any of this part of this gun except the end of the barrel, which is a unique feature. Now, as far as the gun goes, because of this complication of rotating and pulling the cylinder forward to seal it, the action is extremely heavy. Randall has shot this himself and knows just how heavy this is. There's a lot of jokes about it's 20, 30 pounds, but it is probably maybe in the 8 to 9, maybe even into the higher than that. I've never tried it myself, but depends on which one you have. Sometimes they're a little bit better than others, but it's very rough. Single action, a lot better, but double action, it's very rough. The Soviets never really used sidearms as a weapon of war. They were more status pieces. So this was to be given to your officers to basically, as somebody told me, was a motivational tool to prevent troops from deserting or just to help get them the right motivation to charge forward. Now, what's also neat about this is the round it shoots, which is a special, once again, 7.62. The Russians did love that caliber, by 38. And as you can see here, it looks unloaded, but it actually is loaded. This is a Privy Partisan aftermarket. This is a factory brass from them. This is not surplus, but this is designed with the bullet inside the casing, so that it more effectively seals inside the barrel. So the actual part of the surplus ammo, if you ever find any, will actually be a little bit taller than this more crimped down version, and it'll actually sit inside the barrel. So this gun itself was actually made in 1944, so it might have seen action, it might not have. What's interesting about them is that they were made to be disused in actually the early 30s. Now, what's interesting about these guns is, like I said before, the Soviets preferred status symbols for sidearms. These were very, very popular among the Soviet higher-ups, including Joseph Stalin himself. So this is actually extremely common to find in the Soviet Union. It was actually supposed to be replaced in the 30s by the Tokarev, which, as most people know, it's very similar looking to the Browning 9mm, the Browning High Power, I believe. But it never really fully supplanted it. It was never really replaced until the Makarov came out in the late 40s, early 50s, I believe. However, if you go into Russia right now and you ask for a Nagant, they will give you a pistol. It has become basically the slang word for a pistol because it was so commonly found, and a lot of the officers kept them. So you can still find these pretty commonly nowadays. They're not all that rare, but the ammunition is. Really, Privy is the only manufacturer of ammunition, and you can still find surplus, but it's very hard to come by. Reloading is basically not existent. It can be done. It's not very hard to do, but the dies are extremely expensive, and you have to get it just right because you do not want to overpressurize the barrel, or overpressurize the cartridge, Now, there are a lot of people that will shoot 32 out of this. 32 Smith & Wesson, It is possible to shoot 32 Smith & Wesson out of this, but I want to caution people on this. It's not a good idea. Just because you can do it doesn't mean it's a good idea. It does fit, but it's not designed to do that. The barrel and the pressures of the chamber itself are very low. This is not rated to that kind of caliber. These these rounds are very low power firing rounds. So a 32 Smith & Wesson was not very high power to begin with. It's a lot more powerful than this round is. So it's not a good idea, even though it is possible. If you shoot anything above a 32 Smith & Wesson, like a 32, I believe, Long Colt, you will probably blow it up. So I would not recommend it. They do make an aftermarket cylinder. They did for a while that is made to be shot with 32 Smith & Wesson, but still the barrel is not designed for that kind of pressure. So I wouldn't recommend it, and if you ever find one, I did one at one point where somebody was trying to sell it with 32 Smith & Wesson with it, and I'm like, I don't think so. So if you find one and you don't know for sure, it's not a bad idea. They usually aren't going to wear out that much if somebody is doing it, but I would always ask whoever you're trying to buy it from if they use the regular ammo or they tried to shoot 32 out of it. If they did shoot 32, I'd give it a pass. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about collecting now. You may ask yourself, I'm into firearms. Maybe I'm going to start collecting something. It could be anything that you're collecting. Maybe you're even collecting something like a piece of your own history, like as in this 22 my grandfather owned, and one of the very first guns I shot. Actually, this was the very first gun I shot ever. You know, it's just a personal history to me. Aaron's actually has a Colt 1903 that was actually found in a home down here in Southern Illinois with newspapers from 1952 buried in a wall. This is actually made in 1904. I actually went through and looked at the numbers. But you could choose your collection over anything. As in Aaron's collection, you know, collecting the World War I, World War II style rifles or that type of stuff, and actually researching that history is a very, very fun hobby. That knowledge, what brought these guns up, what brought these guns to, to bear on the battlefield. Very, interesting stuff. You might collect subguns like me. I like the subguns. I like shooting the subguns, and I collect them to shoot them, and actually to know a little bit of the history.
If you wanna get into guns, it's not just about shooting. It's about doing a collection. You don't have to do military firearms to be a collector. You can do revolvers. You can do whatever you want.
So if you want to get into collecting, you don't necessarily have to collect historical weapons. You can collect modern weapons. You can collect subguns. You can collect whatever you like. Shotguns, your duck guns. Also nice to have that knowledge to use. So think about collecting if you're also a firearm enthusiast such as Aaron and myself. This is Randy with SIGT signing out.
See ya.